Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to York University. My name is Roger Keil. I'm the director of the City Institute here at York University and proud co-sponsor of this excellent event tonight, which was brought to us by the Neptis Foundation. And we were very happy that the Neptis Foundation came with a proposal, and you will hear more about this, not from me, in a little while, to have this event here at York University. And I mentioned at the time, this is of course a fantastic place to do this because it's right in the middle of a corridor by a subway station that is under construction, so it gives us a lot of things to look at and to think about. And I am very happy that we have our distinguished guests from far away from Vancouver to talk to us tonight. But I'm also extremely happy, not just for the cooperation with the Neptis Foundation, but also want to point out the fact, which is not often enough mentioned here in Toronto, that we have very good relationships with our colleagues at the other schools. And tonight we have, of course, the chair of tonight's panel is a professor at Ryerson University who's going to introduce herself in a second. And we also have, as a co-sponsor of this event, the City Centre at the University of Toronto, whose director, Eric Miller, and I often, and I don't know whether Eric is here, often meet and talk about joint initiatives. So this is one of those events that shows that we're working together in the region, at least at the academic front, and also with our partners in the community. We are happy also I want to mention that briefly, that the Neptis Foundation, as much as other people on the panel in the audience today, are participants in a large research project we have at York University on global suburbanisms, and many of the questions that we're going to talk about tonight also will probably have relevance for what we're going to do. There are, if I can just grab one thing, step away from the mic. There's still a few copies of a book available up there. I also have a few down here that you could grab if you can get one. If you don't find a copy of the book, you can download this book for free of a website. If you go to our website, the City Institute's website, you will find that without any problems. It is a study of 80 square kilometers around York University, which has some very similar problematics to the ones that we hear about today. So I invite you to have a look, as there are a number of people here in the audience actually who have participated in this. It was a big partnership kind of research study with many partners here locally, but also around Canada. That's all I wanted to say. Welcome to York. I'm glad you all found your way, despite the obstacles that the transportation planning has now thrown in our way. And I wish you all a very interesting discussion tonight and a good way home from the suburbs, either into the suburbs, back to the suburbs, or back downtown. And I would like to introduce now the Executive Director of the Neptis Foundation, Tony Coombs.
Okay. Thanks, Jose, and also welcome from Neptis. From me as Executive Director, and from Martha Shuttleworth, who's in the front row here, who is the founder and in various ways the funder of Neptis Foundation. Neptis, you may know, it's actually a Canadian charity, but what it does is to fund and to conduct research into Canadian regions, Canadian urban regions. We're nonpartisan, and our focus it's been mainly Toronto region, but it's on the physical aspects primarily of regional land use, transport, and environment. Before we proceed further, Mr. Bud Purvis over there has kindly agreed to just introduce you and welcome you to York. Now, Bud is a key player in this kind of thing, the population of transit corridors, because he He's the president and a member of the board of the York University Development Corporation, which is why UDC. He has a degree in urban studies from York University, but for this purpose, Bud leads York University's comprehensive physical development activities, all of them, across the board for York University. And that includes the integration of the subway station. I think it's not just one, it's three, in fact, centered on the York University station. Previously, Bud was president of the CN Tower, a role he assumed when, as senior vice president for Trizac Hahn Corporation, he negotiated the rights to manage the CN Tower for the Government of Canada. He also managed the rezoning of the railway lands in downtown Toronto and numerous other development projects across North America. He is active as a director of many prominent boards, including the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, the Canadian Opera Company, the Mars Discovery Centre, and Ontario Realty Corporation. So please welcome Bud.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Roger. It's a wonderful thrill to be here in front of this group sponsored by the Neptus Corporation, and I thank you for your sponsorship of this organization. I've looking into it. You do a lot of good work, and Roger, the work you've been doing is fabulous. So it's an honor to follow you at the stage. When you mentioned the railway lands, I first met Tony when I was at CN Real Estate, and we were working with the city to uncork the railway lands. They've been frozen for 25, 30 years with just nothing going on, and fights between the city and fights between the railway companies. And Tony was working with David Cambie at the Waterfront Trust at that time, if you recall, and I was working with CN, and we worked on basically the issue down there was services, schools, libraries, playgrounds, and daycare, and that was the key to uncorking the railway lands. What the design standards were followed later, but that's when I first ran into Tony, and that was a great work way back when. I hate to say how many years ago that was. The interesting thing was, it's happened. It's now the fastest growing corridor in the country, if you look at the last recently reported census data. So Tony knows of what he's talking about when he talks about this topic right here. As for York University, what I'm going to briefly show you is what's going on in and around the area, and you can look at the slide behind me. I understand the purpose of this forum is to talk about some groundbreaking studies that have gone on in BC. Maybe with Roger's help, you'll come back next year and talk about what we're doing up in this corridor on the Toronto subway corridor going out to Vaughan. Behind me is a slide which shows what is proposed to happen on the new TYSSE subway corridor that goes all the way from Downsview up to the Vaughan Corporate Center. If you look at the slide, you'll see the various projected population areas. Vaughan Corporate Center of 35,000 people. The north side of Steeles Avenue, which is right across the road from the York University campus and centered on the Steeles West Station, could have 15,000 people. In and around York, given the population of the campus itself of 50,000 people and the lands that the secondary plan over the last 4 to 5 years with the City of Toronto at York University, a new secondary plan has been created. And given the fact that there's 3 subway stops here, there's a possibility on the plan of another 14 million square feet to be built, which would be about half and half in the plan that's contemplated between office structures and residential structures. The next stage is to figure out how that comes forward, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Then when we move down the corridor, we see the Jane Finch neighborhood, which currently has 80,000 people. And if you look at Downsview Park, there's another potential population of 44,000 people. The issue that we're now looking at is how, with all this potential population, do we get the best quality of growth and the best economic value for our land, given the competition up and down this corridor. This is just one corridor. If you look in the news, which is hard not to look in, we're talking about Shepherd coming along. We're talking about Eglinton coming along. There's enough population theoretically planned in these various corridors to take up Toronto's growth for about the next 100 years. The issue we're facing here at York is how do we capture our share in the highest quality of growth in and around our subway stations that are being built. Whoops. Where's my slide here? Currently, within the campus, we're looking at a master plan. For our master plan, York has gone out and hired the services of Ken Greenberg and the Planning Partnership. Donna Hind is here from the Planning Partnership, and Ken and Donna have taken York through a series of consultations looking at how we can start to frame our conversation in and around the campus. And coming out of these consultations, there's three main lenses that they're looking at the growth in and around the campus. These are highlighted here at the bottom of the slide, and 7 main pillars that they're looking at. How do we accommodate growth? How do we respond to the momentum for change? Change is the big issue here. It's interesting, when York was first planned, and one of the things we're dealing with the City of Toronto right now is parking. There were 12,000 parking stalls in and around the campus right now. We recently went through, when we did the archive building. Now, the archive building is an interesting example. The archive came to York to be located next to the subway station at York, and it was a decision made by the Ontario government to align infrastructure projects. I think it was a pretty good idea they had way back then. They were thinking about doing that. But when we put up the archive, we had to go to the city and get a variance for 2,200 parking cars, which would have had to have been built under the bylaw to put up the archive building. The city went along with that, but it was an interesting thing that parking counts were still a very big issue at that time. That was only 4 years ago on our campus. The other lenses that we're looking at are greening the campus and infilling the campus. And if you look across the top, the other ones of the pillars that will be focusing in on that are hoping to frame the conversation. Donna and Ken are having focus groups. They've set up a website. We have a Facebook site, and we're trying to gather as many input from as many students and staff as possible to see if these are the right lenses, if these are the right pillars to be looking at, and they'll be framing a look as to what the campus could look at. If you take the 14 million feet and around the area and the potential of the infilling of the campus itself, we end up with a potentiality of the York campus of this is just a model we've built, but what you could be looking at in this area is a series of buildings that looks like this. The challenge for us at York is to come up with a series of buildings and a series of pedestrian level environments that will fit this massive growth that'll come here. What we're finding is it's easy to generate computer models to fill out all the blocks of land. The challenge for York is when the first ones are going to happen and the context in which they're going to be happening. So these are the challenges that are here at York now, and we're very glad that you're here studying this very topic, because over the time period, what you come up with and what your findings are will probably help inform us a great deal at York. So thank you very much, and we welcome the opportunity. It was an honor to be here. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Bud. It's interesting. One of the theories, when one looks at techniques for populating corridors, one of the sort of ways of doing that is with development corporations, which are public, that organize the world to give certainty and to attract development. So it was wonderful to hear that introduction there, and I think it would be good to have a fuller session on that. I would look forward to that. Let me just give you a little bit of what this is about here and why we did it. I'll be as brief as possible. The idea of the event is to consider basically how new development can be induced or to coagulate around the new transit corridors, of which we are in a historic period. It's a vital issue which is not getting much attention. Obviously, the attention is the kind of things that are going on around, do we bury the corridors, do we put them at grade, do we replace the staff, and so on. That's not the subject we're on about here now. What we're on about here is how do we, as a region, bring development to those corridors. We are, I think part of the context here, and why it's really kind of important, is that we are at an extraordinary sort of historic juncture in the making of the Toronto metropolis, if I could call it that. That's the area of 8 million people already, which is way up there among the continental and world urban regions. And I think it's important for a number of reasons. First of all, of course, is the outstanding growth, extraordinary growth by any measure that's occurring here now. The province is anticipating about 1 million new people and 500,000 new jobs per decade. City of Toronto in the last decade took in another 500,000 people. And we have this extraordinary construction period now where we are presently producing, I could hardly believe it when I heard it, 43,000 condominiums. They're under construction now. We have 150 buildings over 10 stories under construction. In New York, there are 60. In Chicago, 20. So it's really quite extraordinary. The second reason why it's a most interesting and pivotal kind of tipping point is that we have most of the weaponry, most of the policies, the plans, the implements, kind of mechanisms for managing growth in this region, like we haven't had since the days of Metro Toronto. And that's a whole renaissance that occurred over the last 10 years, and I might say started by under the premiership of Mike Harris and continued, which is something a lot of people don't quite understand historically, and continued through the McGuinty governments. So we've got all of the policies and that we need, and things are changing. It's hard to tell how much of it's because of the new policies and plans. However, we have the green belt, 2 million square feet, 2 million hectares, or is it acres? Acres, sorry. We have the growth plan for the metropolitan area, the Greater Golden Horseshoe, and we have Metrolinx. Metrolinx seems to be surviving, unlike the Greater Toronto Services Board, his predecessor, which didn't seem to have a chance. This one seems to be. So we have all we need to make a region that is compact and based on intense development around transit and all the benefits that accrue from that: reduced congestion, reduced greenhouse emissions, reduced energy consumption. The third reason is that we have the big move of Metrolinx, and that we'll see how much of that $50 billion program comes forward over the next 20, 30 years, 25 years. But amazingly, we now have under construction about $11 to $12 billion worth of new transit. Remarkable. That's between the line that Bud just described to you and the Eglinton line, which is in fact is being constructed. They're lowering and starting the rigging, the drilling machines on that. However, we can't just assume, we cannot assume that development will automatically build along these corridors. I draw to your attention the Danforth, the Bloor-Danforth line, where that was assumed, and it's actually rather mysterious. For example, along the Danforth, people are still building terrace houses or, one-story Shoppers Drug Marts and so on. We have the tools not to allow that to happen. It's not quite happening. We are also, though, in a new era of funding. It's been the practice, and you can see with these ones that are under construction, the process was that the Mayor of Toronto would go and hold his hand out to the province, to the Premier, and to the federal government and say, I want money. The money came, and it came with no performance criteria. And that can be a terrible thing. It can be around our necks for generations. Because of it, those lines do not have respectable ridership, then we will all be paying, and the municipalities will be paying one way or another through taxes for the upkeep, for the maintenance, the operation, and some of the capital of those lines in perpetuity. It's a very dangerous thing. It could, in fact, if they're not populated, the money for those lines could be regarded as something of a poisoned chalice. So what we're doing now tonight is we've invited these two gentlemen who've been introduced to you to describe some work they've done in Vancouver, which Marcy Birchfield and I had recently come to our attention to start that discussion. Now, for tonight, we have a moderator, which is Pamela Robinson, who has very kindly agreed to perform that role and to organize the discussion and to keep it moving, which we very much thank you, Pamela, for doing that. Pamela is an associate professor of urban and regional planning at Ryerson University. She's a member of the Canadian Institute of Planners and the recipient of many awards and the author of numerous articles and book chapters on Canadian municipal responses to climate change. That subject, in fact, has been the focus of Pamela's research over the last 10 years. Currently, she is evaluating the potential of Web 2.0 tools to engage citizens in their understanding of environmental change. Pamela, to me, is really quite an extraordinary person for the breadth of her activities beyond all of that. She's the Green Space columnist for Spacing magazine. She's secretary of the board of the Greenbelt Foundation, a body that's charged and funded by the province of Ontario to foster the well-being of the Greenbelt. Very important. I think there was an original grant of $25 million to do that. She's a board member of the Metcalfe Foundation, one of the largest, most significant private foundations in Canada. She's a board member of the United Nations Habitat Research Advisory Service. Now, here's an interesting thing. Chair of the Metrolinx Advisory Committee on Electrification, and most recently, chair of Metrolinx's panel to review the next phase of the Big Move, which is called the Big Move 2.0. So I will ask Pamela to take it forward from here. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Now I get the fun job because I get to introduce all the interesting people who are going to speak tonight. For those of you who are wondering, excuse me, how the next hour and a half is going to unfold, we've got Jim Bailey and Ron Kellett, who you all came to see, and they're going to give a very interesting presentation on the Cambie corridor. Then we'll pause for a minute, and we've got panelists sprinkled amongst the audience. They, like you, are sitting in the good seats that they can see, but we're going to bring forth 5 panelists from diverse perspectives to offer a few observations about the translation of the experience from Vancouver to our very complex urban metropolitan region. So just before I invite Jim and Ron up to speak, I want to say a few words about who they are. Jim's a senior planner in the City of Vancouver and in the Citywide and Regional Planning Division. His current work focuses on developing and scoping a new citywide land use corridor and structure program. Most recently, he's the lead planner on the Cambie Corridor Plan, about which we all came to hear tonight, and he continues to work on its implementation, which will be very interesting. To move from plan to implementation is one of the challenges that we face here, so we look forward to your wisdom in that regard. Before he was a city planner in Vancouver, he worked for the municipality of West Vancouver and worked on a number of environmental policies, including the District Environmental Sustainability Strategy and the Watercourse Protection Regulation. He was also a program coordinator for the Better Environmentally Sound Transportation Organization and an environmental planning consultant, both in Canada and abroad. He's on the board of an organization called the 3 Links Care Society, which is a local nonprofit that focuses on the work of seniors' care and housing. He's got an undergrad degree from Simon Fraser and a master's from the School of Urban and Regional Planning at UBC. Ron Kellett is his colleague tonight, and Ron's a professor of landscape architecture who won a very prestigious Killam Teaching Prize this year. So we have to clap for that because that's a very big deal. Just fantastic. And he holds degrees in environmental studies and architecture. He's practiced sustainable architecture in British Columbia and taught at the University of Oregon. And since the 1990s, his work has focused on the intersection of issues of urban quality and form and environmental issues and the development of form-based decision tools for urban design. His research and consulting and writing influenced patterns of urban growth and development in several Canadian and American cities, and he's contributed in a very significant way to green urban design processes, plans and codes, and standards and guidelines. If you're interested in his work, he's co-authored a book with Cynthia Grilling called Skinny Streets and Green Neighborhoods, Designed for an Environment and Community, from Island Press in 2005. And that was about the making of green neighborhoods and something called Elements DB, which is a web application of measured and care-based data for urban design. And this work has been also recognized for its excellence by organizations like the American Planning Association, the American Association of Landscape Architects, the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects, the U.S. National Association of Home Builders, and the U.S. National and Urban Community Forest Advisory Council. In 2004, he joined the Landscape Architecture program at UBC, where he continues to work and teach studios, and he offers a lecture course on environment and urban form, as well as supervising graduate students. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the podium over to our colleagues from Vancouver. Thank you.
Didn't get to. Thank you very much, Pamela. Thank you, Neptis Foundation, York University, University of Toronto. You've been terrific hosts, and we're pleased to be able to come out and to talk to you. Jim and I, our affiliation is about as long as the work that we're going to show you here today. We met a couple of years ago. People can't hear me? Is that what you're trying to tell me? Oh, okay. You could be more explicit. All right. Well, I don't know. All right. Thank you. So we've known each other for a couple of years. We started working on the Cambie Corridor project together and have, through the course of those experiences, I think, begun to build a kind of interesting relationship around kind of how you might go about doing planning that results in the kinds of things we care a lot about, which is transit, environment, and urban form. So we'll kind of walk through several pieces of a presentation for you today. I'll do the beginning couple of points here, not the least of which is that for many of you, you have to understand a little bit about planning culture in Vancouver. It's definitely different. And just to kind of help you understand that the work you will see did exist in a political, social, cultural, economic context that may or may not reflect your own. It's just the way it is, and the way any organization, any community responds to those contexts is, in fact, a huge part of what planning is all about. Then Jim will talk to you about the processes that we went through to actually do the plan, which I think you will find quite interesting because it touches on many of the themes that our introducing colleagues have kind of laid out for you. And then we think one of the big takeaways for you might be what it took to get to yes. There was a lot of negotiation along the way here, and a lot of it had to do with a fairly nuanced kind of understanding of what people's values and interests were and trying to find common ground among them. And I think, again, that is no small part of the planning process. And we think the Cambie Corridor is an interesting story about getting to yes as much as it's an interesting story about planning. And then the plan was passed not that long ago. It was in May of 2011. And so we'll share with you some of the first results of what that's been, some of the proposals that have come out of it, and kind of where we are, not quite a year later, but almost a year later. So to kind of start on this, as was mentioned, I moved to Vancouver in 2004, and about the same time a plane load of dollars landed from the federal government and other places to pay for some transit infrastructure. So in 2005, all of a sudden, I won't say out of nowhere, but we didn't have it before, a significant amount of money landed into Vancouver to create capacity for a transit line that did not exist at the time. And that transit line ended up being a very important one. First, it joined two incredibly important destinations, downtown and the airport. How important is that? But it also passed along a street that was one of the significant heritage boulevards of Western Canada, and it also passed through many of the established residential areas of Vancouver. So it was about to reveal lots of questions and lots of opportunities here. Not the least of which was an answer to the question, how big a hole do you have to dig to bury $2.1 billion? And it generally, depending on how you go about it, technology matters here. If you do cut and cover, it looks like the one on the left, and if you hire a boring machine from Austria, it looks like the one on the right. Even though this kind of dropped out of the sky in 2005, it did not take long for it to have a very large footprint and a very large in-your-face presence for many of us in Vancouver. By 2010, we'd all forgotten about the hole, and we'd all forgotten about all the other horrible things that happened along the way, because the line was an incredible success, far more successful than any of the transit planners had thought. There were lineups to get onto it, not just because it was a new line, but because, again, it joined these two significant destinations, downtown and the airport, and the Olympics were coming, and it joined many of the significant venues along there. So all of a sudden, $2.1 billion creates all this capacity that people just glommed onto almost immediately. And as a matter of fact, that line met its year 3 ridership goals in the first year and has not slipped as much as you would think. It has slipped a bit from the Olympic year, but it has not gone back to what it was before the Olympics. It's actually seen a significant increase in ridership. So there's no question this was a strategic and successful investment to have made from a transit point of view. With that in mind, the question about, well, what kind of city does one start to pack around that all of a sudden elevates? We have a major infrastructure investment, 19 kilometers long. We have a whole bunch of people that want to ride it. What kind of a city do they want to ride to and from as they move along it? And like many of you, I'm sure, are aware, there's a kind of very significant trajectory to all the big infrastructure investments we make. And as a matter of fact, things like street networks and transit infrastructure are among the most enduring, and they last for hundreds of years. And if we just think about some of the cities we love, it's kind of humbling for you to remember that I'm not sure what they thought about in Paris in 1740, but I hope they've thought about the right things, because Paris today still has the remnants of some of those important moves here. So it was one of those moments where just thinking about how significant the choices about what city would attach itself to that infrastructure became. So out of that, there's a series of themes that kind of run through today's discussion. The two on the horizontal axis are the ones that are probably what you expected to hear about. That is the relationship between land use and transit, and we'll certainly talk about that. But the ones on the top and the bottom are no less related to the success of the ones across the middle. And that is the relationship between energy and the future of cities. We have to be smarter about how we plan to distribute and allocate low-carbon energy sources in the future. We need to start planning our cities around how that flow works. And then on the top, the notion that all of those investments have to kind of create some kind of public domain in which we feel proud to inhabit. So here we are in 2010 or so, got transit, need land use to accompany this. And just to kind of touch on a few of the important themes here, one of them, of course, is density. And the reason I bring it up is not because I don't think you know that, but there's a little subtler piece in it that you might not think about quite as much. And that is that, the relationship between the relationship between transit technologies and density is, basically linear. The more sophisticated the transit system and the more passengers you need to ride, you need to make sure that along that route are sufficient passengers that are going to be able to provide the ridership that will make that transit journey successful. So if you kind of look on the right, the kind of system that we're talking about here, even though it's a subway, there's a big hole, it has a kind of light rail scale to it. And that's kind of the way SkyTrain works in Vancouver. They're smallish trains and they just run frequently. So they're not long trains like you have in Toronto. They're actually quite short trains. So in order to make those successful, we're looking at places that need to generate about 150 to 250 people and jobs per hectare. And it's the people and jobs part that's significant here for a second. So again, I don't think you don't know this, but what we really wanted to get to here was not only 150 plus people along the corridor that are likely to get on the train well, at least once during the day. What we'd really like them to do is get off and on at regular intervals so that the capacity of the train can be better optimized for that passenger load, right? What you really don't want is the situation like they have in Calgary, where we did some work a few years before, which does the opposite, which puts all the jobs at the end of the line and all the people at all the stops along the way. And so the train just gets fuller and fuller in the morning as it goes in, and then it's empty most of the day, and then it's full as you go back. And as a matter of fact, our City of Calgary colleagues were always joking about the fact that if you lived beyond about the midpoint station along the way, what you'd do in the morning is take the train out to the distant suburban one so you could get a seat and read your book coming back in the other way. So not only does it make economic sense, there's a certain quality of life component to this that's not small. The other thing is that Vancouver's had SkyTrain technology for about 20 years, 30 years, I mean. And what have we learned from that? Well, what is the city that gets shaped by transit according to the way we've been shaping it by transit, at least our most recent experience? And so the question was, at least to the Cambie corridor group, which is, okay, if we now know that if we want to move people around at about 80 to 90 kilometers per hour at stations that are about 1 to 1.5 kilometers apart, which is kind of what TransLink wants you to do, you need to start thinking about how big are those stations. So again, if you have to get 150 to 250 people or jobs per hectare, and they need to be in walking distance of the station, that's a pretty dense little node. And depending on how far the stations are apart, there may or may not be much in between, because it may have sucked up all the development that might have happened in that area. Right, so I'll just give you one example, and this is an early example, 1991, Metrotown, which was one of the first employment nodes that was put on the SkyTrain line. It has about 12,500 dwellings, about 18,500 jobs, so it's about 150 people and jobs per hectare, but you can see the urban form that grows up around that. It's basically a suburban context where it needs to generate that much ridership of people and jobs in a small amount of space. So it looks a lot like a mall with a couple of towers stuck in it. So the question for the Cambie corridor team was, all right, so if we don't want to do that anymore, we need to do a better job of thinking about, well, how does the public realm have presence in this? And so one looks back at, well, how did Vancouver do this in the past? And there were times, not that far long ago, relatively speaking, where we kind of got it. The Bartholomew Plan in the 1920s and 30s really was a plan that laid out major road networks, which could be major transit networks today, and then looked at what the development patterns that one might attach to them and insert in them. So this diagram, while it has absolutely nothing to do with the Cambie corridor, has a lot to do with a way of thinking across scales and thinking about how big moves that happen at a regional or city scale need to be backed up by smaller moves that happen at a pedestrian and neighborhood scale. A way to think about this is I kind of think about planning across these scales as like the Russian doll problem. There's a scale inside a scale inside a scale inside another scale. So the question would be is if we think about how different decisions are made at different scales, what would the new transit town look like if we started to kind of look at where the flow and connectivity of decision making might be? So if we started at the top left, we need to make sure there are jobs and infrastructure in the right places from a regional point of view, kind of going clockwise around our book cover there. We might start thinking about how local land uses implement those regional goals and infrastructure. We might look at how context-sensitive urban design helps us make better places out of that local land use planning, and we might make sure that it's possible to create strong architecture and good public realm out of all those pieces. So this one's way more complicated, but it's the same point. So if you kind of look at what might happen at a region scale, 1 to 50,000 maps, for example, and how there might be other choices about how those major transit corridors, population and job centers allocate themselves to specific places within that region, and so on and so on. So the trick is to how do we figure out how to move back and forth across those scales, make the right decision at the right scale, or certainly not contradict them, perhaps, would be another way of thinking about that. So that's the preamble to the plan. The last few slides before I hand this over to Jim have to do with the planning culture, and this is as much a part of a little reflection on my education about going to Vancouver as it is on something that might be useful to you. But in a way, Vancouver's always been a transit town. It was the city at the end of the train line for the longest time, and land use planning and transportation choices have been so closely linked together, and the transportation choices have always come first. We think about things like there was an urban rail network that ran through the Lower Mainland, and so the beginnings of the settlement pattern of where the major concentrations of growth were actually attached to that interurban pattern, which is the reddish area along the bottom. And this is my neighborhood in Vancouver. We had a kind of a streetcar in a forest for the longest time, again, to give you just a demonstration of the degree to which the transportation choices preceded the land use and planning choices. And you may or may not be able to see the sign on the right, but you can imagine that there might have been a conversation with the developers of 1909 about creating access to new blocks of land that the people who live there might be able to get downtown and work. And so all of a sudden, this land out there is quite valuable. So here's probably the first preview center for a housing development in history in 1909 here. And just to give you a sense of, that was a pretty smart decision. The picture inset into that is that same place in about 1999, I'm guessing, so about 90 years later. Still a transit corridor, still a walkable, it's still a place that I think if there was a renderings in 1909, I think they might have had those buildings in them. So as you could see, that same sort of planning, you see it in many places in Vancouver, that you see lots of kind of neighborhoods and commercial centers that have grown up around where those streetcar investments were. And this is a map of the early streetcar system and when pieces were added. And I won't go through them because it's more detail than we need today. But if you know those areas, you might well remember that until that streetcar went there, that probably wasn't a successful commercial place or a successful residential place. The flip side of that was all the planning that didn't have traction. And you may or may not know, Vancouver was almost a city of freeways in the 1960s. All those red lines are just what they look like, except they're passing over neighborhoods that you might now know as Chinatown and Gastown and the waterfront. So there was initial kind of moves to do kind of big-scale automobile planning that kind of overwrote much of that history of the city, and you can see what impact it might have had on the spatial quality of that place. And it's one of the first times that Vancouverites kind of rose up in unison to kind of resist something, and that freeway was stopped, and people went to jail, and there was all kinds of relationships and other sorts of forces put in motion here where the relationship between transportation and planning also had a significant kind of activist side to it. And as a matter of fact, I'm proud to say I live in one of the few communities in the world where our regional strategic plan can be still drawn on a cocktail napkin. Vancouver still kind of, because this was what, if you don't do freeways, well, what do you do? Well, this was the answer in 1975. It was really a city of concentrated villages linked together by transportation arteries. In most cases, they are transit lines that link them together. And I swear, if you go there, it's not that different today as you look around. And then the last piece of this little planning culture in Vancouver is that Vancouver is very interested in seeing itself on a kind of larger world global stage. And actually the tagline there is UBCs, because we're out in the far distant end of Vancouver, so we get to be even more of a place of mind than Vancouver is, because we're the last bit of terrain before you fall into the ocean over on the left-hand side there. So roughly after the Olympics, Vancouver initiated a series of planning actions, not the least of which was called the Greenest City Plan, which, to grossly oversimplify it today, was 10 goals with the purpose of which was to make Vancouver the greenest city by 2020. 3 of those are very relevant to planning that was happening in the corridor, and they're very relevant to our conversation today. I'll just highlight them. One was on climate leadership, and the notion that Vancouver was going to have targets that were more aggressive than other cities in Canada would have. So kind of hang on to that for a second. That means we need to reduce mobility energy demand, and we need to make buildings, or we need to make energy use in buildings more efficient than they are today. And you can see, if not by the numbers, certainly by the length of the lines there, is that the targets for dropping Vancouver's by 2020 are considerably more aggressive than many cities might be. So that line dropping down from right to left there gives you a sense of what the city has set as ambitious targets for itself. I had mentioned the notion of green mobility. The big idea there is that by 2020, at least 50% of trips will be on foot, bicycle, and public transit. That's a significant number for Vancouver, or as it would be for most cities, I would think. And then finally, the green buildings goal, which has to do with lead the world in green building design and construction. And let me take that one and open it up a little bit first. Because one of the big ideas there is that by thinking of buildings in groups, we might be able to make progress against that buildings goal more readily than doing them one at a time. And one of the significant ways that Vancouver has seen some progress in that is by looking at the role of district energy technologies in helping drop the amount of energy demand, and also being able to supply that energy demand or meet that energy demand with more benign sources. So in the case of Southeast False Creek, which is the Olympic Village, it not only used a neighborhood energy utility that every building must plug into, it also captured that heat from reclaiming heat energy from hot water that was passing through the sewage line. So it was completely a heat exchange system based on waste heat being generated for other purposes. So moving forward into the Cambie Corridor Plan, the idea was that not only should we do all the what we know about land use and transportation and green mobility practices, how could we integrate some thinking around how district energy might shape the nature of development in this place as well? And to kind of grossly oversimplify this, which is good enough for today, is that most things about rapid transit supportive land use, density, and form are also district energy supportive. You could more or less get 2 for 1 out of this. There are some variations, but they're definitely headed in the same direction with each other. So hence, energy, transportation, land use, public realm are now all out on the table. So this one's a much harder one to do because designing district energy system is a very technically complex endeavor. So we decided that the only way we were going to be able to tackle this is more or less on a benchmark basis. So we kind of looked around at places that were around us and grabbed 2 comparators, both of which were in British Columbia. One was Dockside Green in Victoria, and the other one was the Olympic Village district energy utility, which I just showed you a photograph of a minute ago. What we learned is that the heat load that those places meet was a meaningful number, because that told you roughly how many square feet of buildings, how close to the energy utility you needed to get to. And so Dockside Green has 1.75 gigawatt hours per hectare per year, so that's how dense the heating energy is packed, and Southeast False Creek was about 3. And so while we couldn't do the engineering that could test this, we knew that if we could get land use alternatives that put thermal heating density between those 2 benchmarks, we had the possibility of coming back later and doing something more effective. So Jim will tell you the story of the project.
Thanks, Ron. Before I start, I'd really like to thank the Neptus Foundation. This is fantastic to give us the opportunity to come out. Every time we come to Toronto, I think we learn a ton, so it's nice to be able to reciprocate with some of the ideas that we have. And it's also that, I think, a second point before I start is this is also very humbling, because, I mean, what we're about to talk about is one way forward, and it's not the way. And hopefully this provides some ideas and thoughts to move forward, but recognizing that we don't even know how this is going to land necessarily on the ground in the city. So it's learning and ongoing learning going forward. So this is, again, a humbling experience. So thank you very much. Before I start, and building on Ron's discussion about the planning and culture in Vancouver, I'd also like to really introduce other context that has a profound influence on how we plan in the city with implications for the Cambie Corridor. Vancouver is really quite unique, and I think it really deserves mentioning before I kind of get into the nuts and bolts of the plan. And the first part of that is the Vancouver Charter. And it's important from a governance perspective to understand that we operate under our own charter, and it means that we can request from the province of British Columbia and usually receive legislation to address our needs. And a couple of those key things are that our charter permits us to designate zones with no uniform regulations, and developers and applicants that come in must respond to the requirements established by the Planning Department and the Director of Planning to obtain council approval for the form of development. So we have a lot of discretion there granted to us through our charter. Very important discretionary piece of legislation that we have. Secondly, the charter allows us to require public amenities in exchange for development rights. And again, that's very, very key as one of our kind of our key tenements in the city is sort of density, but density done well. And it's the exchange of amenities that really makes that happen in the city, and we have the legislation to achieve that. So this Made in Vancouver legislation permits a flexible response to local needs. Also, the other thing I always need to say when we talk in Ontario is that compared with cities in Ontario, there's no equivalent in British Columbia of the Ontario Municipal Board. Decisions by Vancouver Council are not appealable to a provincial body. The regional relationship is also worth mentioning. So the GVRD, the Greater Vancouver Regional District, is the only large Canadian urban region that's not an amalgamated unicity. We remain a regional partnership with all the different member municipalities, which is based on consensus. The principal function of Metro Vancouver is to administer resources and services which are common across the metropolitan region. So these includes things like water governance, planning, sewer, drainage, housing, transportation, air quality, and parks. TransLink, and just a little logo down there is at the bottom, is the organization that's responsible for regional transportation network of Metro Vancouver, including the major roads and bridges. So regionally, and this is quite interesting, we have an integrated transportation system. So, one ticket gets you on everything. You get on the C bus, you get on the bus, you get on the SkyTrain, the Canada Line, everything. It's an integrated system across the region. So overall, one of the big themes of our governance structure is we have kind of a regional coordination, the efficiency of regional provision of infrastructure, but the flexibility of locally administered zoning, which gives us the discretion to make a really local, made in Vancouver approach for how we do development and business. The other thing that's really key, and I want to talk about this, is issues of setting and a buoyant economy. So Vancouver, by and large, is a peninsula surrounded by water and beaches and framed by the North Shore Mountains. It creates a spectacular setting with high amenities. It also offers geographic constraints to growth and access. That's really key. Vancouver, you're either bumping up into the mountains in the back, you're going into the water, or you're starting to bump into agricultural land. So there are some natural constraints that really start to help us in terms of the big question around densification. In addition to the setting, during most of the past 30 or so years, the Vancouver area has experienced rapid growth. So generally speaking, a buoyant economy has meant that we have had the luxury to say no to development that doesn't work for us. We can require developers to provide a full range of infrastructure, parks, affordable housing, and social services. And that's really quite key. The economy in Vancouver, and when we meet around the table, sometimes it seems like Vancouver is one of the only places that's doing well in a North American context, particularly during some of the last downturns in the last few years. So in that context, the Cambie corridor and the plan that we worked on was a huge opportunity. And so again, building on what Ron said, Cambie Street is one of the city's arterial streets linking Richmond and the airport to downtown Vancouver. Now, as it cuts through most of the city, it's going through a lot of single-family neighborhoods, really low-density residential single-family neighborhoods. So part of this plan has all been about, it's the kind of the Ellen Dunham Jones concept of retrofitting suburbia. The big plan challenge was to go through what was established single-family neighborhoods and establish a different pattern based on the transit infrastructure. So the plan is really based on a corridor approach, and it really represented a departure in thinking for us. Originally, back in 2005, the thinking along this line was that the planning would take place one station at a time. A new corridor approach sought to accelerate the work and to take advantage of the investment in the Canada Line. I mean, there were some things that happened that were really out of our control, and in some way the corridor approach was a bit more happenstance than actually design. When we were looking at a stationary approach, the line was just being built, as Ron had said, but the city then had a number of staff turnovers, had a number of changes, and the planning department really couldn't get their act together. Then we went on strike for a long time. We had a 3-month strike, decimated our department, and we just didn't get the planning going. So in some ways, the one station at a time approach, we said, we better get going on this, and we adapted it. It made sense from a corridor perspective, but there were also some institutional and things happening in City Hall that made it make sense from just a work organizational perspective. Definitely worth noting. It's kind of sometimes the juxtaposition of luck and circumstance. Very key to this is given the size of the study area now going along in a corridor approach, and we wanted to take immediate advantage of the areas around rapid transit, the plan is phased, and this was really critical in the work. Phase 1 provided planning principles for the whole corridor, so overall guiding principles that we spent a lot of time working with folks on for the whole corridor. And what it also did is we set an interim rezoning policy at this time. So before we got into the more detailed planning for the whole arterial, we established interim rezoning policy at the key stations here, so Marine Drive, Langara, which is next to a college, university, a large sort of urban area here where there's a large shopping mall redevelopment and a more residential area. We basically and strategically said, for the sites that are right at the station, we're going to allow developers who wanted to come forward with rezoning applications that met certain criteria. And what that did is it took some of the pressure off us, quite frankly, and allowed development to start happening while we did more of the planning. It also allowed us to learn from that development, and there was sort of an iterative process where the development applications actually helped shape policy. Certainly challenging, but very instructive for us as we moved along. We completed phase 2 this year, so when Ron talked about the plan being approved in May of 2011, that was phase 2, looking at the key arterial and the major arterials in the study area, not just the north-south line, but also the east-west connectors at 4 different intervals along the line. And phase 3 will follow, so there's still work that needs to happen. And one of my colleagues, Lil Ronalds, is sitting down here in the front row, is charged with some of that work, looking at the areas surrounding the arterial itself. And so we still need to do this. So this is very much a work in progress. The plan represents what I think is a very innovative and progressive approach to planning. I think it's stuff we all know, but we had actually started to land on the ground. It integrates land use, transportation, and energy with other goals around complete and socially resilient communities. And this is really part of the things that's looked at the big picture of sustainability, linking the social component as well. The plan approach drew on expertise from all of our city departments. It's not a planning department plan necessarily, and represents a significant collaboration. One of our councillors noted that in the report there was no sustainability section. And we really made the point of that it wasn't about a sustainability section, that the whole plan represented sort of a paradigm shift in thinking. Fundamental to the plan is the linking of urban design excellence and sustainability performance metrics. It wasn't just about urban design, it wasn't just about sustainability performance, and this was really what Ron's collaboration at the university helped us with. The plan links building form with transit and district energy viability. We also worked hard to ensure financial viability along the way, engaging with and working with developers to understand the different economic pro formas associated with different building forms. And that was really key as well as we tried to move our way forward, those types of partnerships. The point is that the plan is about many things and has many drivers and metrics of success. And this is really key. And again, this kind of speaks to the phasing. In phase 1, we established a series of principles. Early on, the principles that were developed and adopted by Council to help guide the planning work for the corridor. They set the tone and the direction for the work that we are now presenting. So before we started talking about building forms and projection, we did a lot of work to gather consensus around what we cared about, what our values were, and they were established in different principles. So those principles included things like, and these are just the headings of the principles. We spend a lot of time with the community, and I can't stress how much time we did spend with the community with our sleeves rolled up, working hard on this type of stuff to kind of get to the values in terms of what matters. Those principles include things like provide a land use that optimizes the investment in transit, provide a complete community, create a walkable and cyclable corridor of neighborhoods seamlessly linked to public transit, focus intensity and community activity at stations and other areas with strategic opportunities for sustainability. This is really quite key. This is like talking about where we're actually going to put the density. This one sentence captures a lot of work, and there's obviously stuff underneath it, but captured a lot of work and thinking and let us move forward in terms of where we're actually going to start landing things on the ground. Provide a range of housing choices and affordability, balance citywide and regional goals with the community and its context, and finally ensure job space and diversity. Again, this is a plan not just about residential density, and I kind of joke that you could build anything in Vancouver, it would sell. It's also about job space and making sure that there's job space and destinations balanced along the corridor. And again, one of the key things that you'll see in some of the subsequent slides is that at the stations themselves and in certain zones, there's a real emphasis on landing job space, not just residential space in the corridor. So the second phase of work that we just completed, and which kind of constitutes the plan as it is today, took those principles and turned them into action. In essence, landing the principles on the ground via the built form, public realm, and social policy. So where to start in this discussion? And I've always kind of struggled about where we start. Do we just jump into the buildings? And it's kind of, no, I don't think that we do. And Ron hinted to the kind of the process and sort of the real importance of the public realm is what really knits this together and makes it real on the ground. The plan is not just about the buildings. We know that in building complete communities, the public realm is critical. In that sense, this plan approach sets policy direction with respect to energy, movement, connections, lanes, public places, green space, habitat, and servicing. And then it identifies the next steps to make those things happen. The plan sets a course and expects a more detailed public realm plan will ensure implementation. So let's just start, and I'll go through the different elements of the public realm that really set the foundation for the corridor. District energy was really, really key, and I put it first even before some of the transportation pieces. The plan sets a framework for district energy that will take us towards a system where the energy used to heat and cool homes is provided by low-carbon, energy-efficient sources. One of the key parts of this is that every new development along this line must be connectable to district energy systems, and there's certain size thresholds where we require developers to build district energy systems or to look at the feasibility for district energy systems that will then patch into the larger system. And we're working on implementing this as we move forward, but a real kind of departure and key piece of the work in the plan. The plan prioritizes walking, biking, and transit, and in that order, and this is really key, the plan prioritizes walking. When we first started this plan, one of the key kind of design principles was that walking was first, and then that kind of spoke to the type of community, building complete communities around the stations, and that biking and transit came afterwards. And at some points when we started talking about this, it made the Transit Authority very, very nervous. They're like, we just spent $2 billion on a transit system, and you're talking about walking first? And our attitude was, well, yeah, I mean, because all transit trips start and end on your feet. And if you can build an environment where people walk, they will always take transit as the discretionary trip, and people will just buy their transit passes, and that's proving out to be really true. And when you look to other cities where there is excellent transit, it's all about walking first. The key things, though, was that the infrastructure was safe, attractive, convenient, navigable, barrier-free, and accessible. And if you'll notice sort of, I'll go back to this one actually, you'll notice the diagrams, it's not just about the line itself, sort of the north-south, it's very much about the connections east and west and the connections to different destinations. Part of the fundamental piece of this in terms of the movement network was the relationship with the corridor and then how you get off of it to the different destinations, whether they be places of amenity, places of employment, places of jobs. So really quite a key structure there. Connections, again, was very key. Connections to nature and parks are provided, including an emphasis on breaking down blocks to provide access to green space. We set a real sort of tone with where some of the longer blocks are and how we want to break those down to have a finer grain pattern where people can walk and bike. The Bartholomew plan that Ron showed Vancouver as really a grid city, but one of the key things when you start to squint and look at that plan is there's a lot of lanes in Vancouver, and in fact the whole kind of urban fabric and pattern is dominated by lanes in the city of Vancouver. And this plan has a strategy in it to engage those lanes instead of turning away from the lanes to make lanes sort of active, lively places, also balancing with the need to service buildings. So our strategies shift as you get from a commercial area to a residential area, but certainly there's a lot more emphasis on creating lanes as sort of active places to be. One of the things that you'll notice with some of our building forms, and a lot of the building forms, frankly, along the corridor, is that where there are lanes, if you, for example, had a 6-story building fronting on the main arterial street, there's a 6-story building, a courtyard, and then sort of a lane row house fronting right onto the lane with maybe just a 2-foot setback from the lane. So there's actually a housing form on the lane that changes the whole nature and character of those lanes. And that was a long, tough discussion with our engineering department, but we have a very progressive engineering department, and we've found ways to implement and balance off issues of servicing and access with them. So I mean, it can be done. The key piece, too, was that there's a series of plazas and mini parks provided throughout the corridor, offering important areas for social interactions. The plazas are really varied in character depending on where they're at, and really kind of represents, the place where people would go along the corridor. We had Jan Gell out to look at this, and he said, yeah, this plan don't worry about the buildings. What makes a city great is, where you sit and have a cappuccino in your plaza and watch the pretty people go by. That's what urbanism is about. So we've tried to create those spaces in this corridor as part of the fabric that links it all together. Green space is prioritized. I mean, Vancouver is an extremely green place, just the aesthetic of it. So we had to work really hard to make best use of existing green space, adding green space where possible, and ensuring the protection and enhancement of the Heritage Boulevard. And finally, a habitat strategy is provided, and the habitat strategy looks at both aquatic and terrestrial habitat, so land and sea. The Fraser River is in the south, so there's a lot of there's a lot of work looking at improving the riparian habitat along that, looking at daylighting streams that go and connect to that area. It's definitely part of that work. And creating, building regulations and opportunities, not regulations, building guidelines that talk about things like rainwater management, so that the whole stormwater system is linked into an overall system that improves riparian habitat, as opposed to just a functional get it to the river as fast as you can. Key to this plan and central to it is the commitment to social diversity and resilience. The plan provides important direction on pressing issues such as housing, affordability, and social inclusion. And the work acknowledges that continued enhanced livability and affordability are key to the resilience of the corridor. And one of the key pieces of this, and this is a really interesting piece moving forward in terms of how we're actually implementing this, is that there's an affordable housing strategy for the Cambie corridor that really tries to get at the whole spectrum of housing, the whole housing continuum, so that low and moderate income families, key workers, seniors, and those with impaired health or mobility can continue to find good housing options in the corridor close to transit. So what we've done here is we've set a target for rental housing at 20%, but we had a bit of a nuance on that, because we did, in our economic testing, which was really part of our key discussion with developers and the industry, we didn't know that 20% would work in all opportunities, if 20% rental housing was financially viable. So what we did is we sent a 20% rental target, but we tied it to the community amenity contribution that was generated by the rezoning, and said that only half of that, we would cap it at half of the community amenity contribution, so that bundle of goods that we would negotiate as part of the rezoning, only half of that would go to the rental housing. So we're starting to see some of that built, and it doesn't happen in all cases, because some of the smaller projects can't generate the cash or amenity to pay for that. But that was our approach there. The real goal looking at providing that diversity in housing stock. On some of the larger sites, so the sites that are shown in yellow, we continue to have the requirement to provide 20% non-market housing in those sites, so that can be subsidized also through higher levels of government. So in terms of built form, and this is really key, Vancouver is known as a city of neighborhoods, and it really is kind of stuck in our culture and in our thinking. And so this plan very quickly went from being, in some ways, it kind of drove me crazy, because it went from being a corridor to a series of neighborhood plans, because you couldn't get away from, and I say drive me crazy, because instead of going to one set of meetings, we were going to 4 or 5 sets of meetings to deal with the neighborhood issues along the corridor. So it just became very tiring, and my wife didn't see me very much for a while. So the idea is that Vancouver is a city of neighborhoods, and so the built form responds to the character of those different neighborhoods with diversity in each of those different points. The other thing worth noting is the built form response marks an important departure from Vancouver, what I call Vancouver 1.0, the podium tower. And the predominant typology on Cambie is a mid-rise building with sensitive transitions to the surrounding neighborhoods. We took a lot of what we learned from Southeast False Creek and other mid-rise developments like the Arbutus lands, and said, instead of downtown postcard podium tower, this is going to be much more about a mid-rise typology in a lot of places with different distribution. Still towers in some places, but so it's not your buzz cut 6-story building. It's 6 and then a tower, 6 and then a tower, 5, and then with different setbacks and spacing depending on where you're at in the corridor. So what I'll do now is run through some of those neighborhoods to kind of give you an example of what we're talking about. Really key to this, and I'll just look at my time here, was what we did and what we talked about. And so we showed people graphically a lot of the work that we did. So spent a ton of time on this and really tried to connect with people about what things would look like. I joked the other day, and well, I wasn't joking. I mean, somebody said this, that the plan looked a little bit more like a wallpaper magazine as opposed to a boring City of Vancouver policy plan. And we really tried to convey graphically what this looked like in renderings. And we went farther than just the SketchUp models. We went to renderings of what it would look like that showed character and showed people in place, and tried to kind of connect that humanist element to what this place would be like in the future. So for each of these places, we did a description of neighborhood character, street level and bird's eye views, and provided specific heights, densities, and land uses, as well as section drawings. And it was really, the section drawings are really, really key, because one of the key pieces of pushback was the relationship to the adjacent properties. So we had to show people, sun angles, relationships, and how those things worked. So I'll run through those quickly. So Cambie Village, an area in the north of the plan, fairly low, 4 to 6, 6 to 8 stories, showing the sections. Some job space here, but not a huge job space generator. Queen Elizabeth Park, another area going around, sort of a ceremonial, meandering boulevard next to a park. Very green, very open, but again, large setbacks here, a 6-story typology. Oak Ridge Town Center is where things really start to get cranked up, where we have a large mall site redevelopment that we expect. And right now there's existing policy that has towers on it up to 24 stories. I expect that will be revised to see more aggressive density on that. But really getting into some very significant densities along this area with just the surrounding kind of background buildings in the 12-story range, going down to 4 as you kind of peel away from the corridor itself. Langara College Station, very close to a university, so kind of making sure that we're connecting into that relationship and the ridership that the university generates, and the body heat from that. And Marine Landing, where again this is sort of the end of the station, right on the corridor, where there are a number of towers planned, and this is some of the towers that are planned. Ranging in sort of the 285, 300-foot range. There's a tower at 335, and a number of large office developments at this site. For all of these areas, and this is really key, and again, the work with Ron, very important, the plan sought to reconcile the graphically displayed urban design with the sustainability performance. And our partnership with UBC was critical in that regard, and Ron can describe it a little bit later. Also, the public consultation process was very broad and robust. We built on our Phase 1 outreach with the principals and talked to a lot of people about the built form, and showed people very graphically what we were doing and really tapped into people's values. We used the tried and true methods, open houses, boards, that type of stuff, but also tried to get into a younger audience with social media films and web coverage. The other thing that's worth noting too is just the kind of the diversity of this corridor. About 40% of the people on the corridor, their mother tongue was Mandarin or Cantonese. So we had a lot of kind of multicultural outreach that we really needed to get into, and that was a very challenging piece of work as well, but one that I think that we pulled off. So now I'm going to touch on, how we did this, how we approved the plan, and how we got to yes, what I think are some of the really key elements in this moving forward. So within City Hall, one of the key pieces of this was that I don't think this plan succeeded because of the planning department. I think it succeeded because we were able to bring together departments from the whole city to shape directions. We had buy-in from our senior management team, which is very key in terms of providing direction and kind of forward movement. Oh, hang on, I went too far there. At our staff level, we created a technical team with representatives from various departments: housing, sustainability, engineering, social development, and parks, to wrestle with the associated trade-offs. We had a lot of buy-in at a corporate level and as a planning department. Involving the current and future public, and this is really, really key to this plan, and it wasn't just about engaging with the people who live there now. I think one of the reasons why this plan succeeded was because there was a significant emphasis on engaging younger people. As the plan was future-looking, we worked extremely hard to connect with people generally under the age of 35. So predictably, we would have open houses that included boomers with interested in protecting the status of their status quo property rights. But to balance this perspective, we worked hard and we went out to people. We knocked on doors and we talked to a lot of people, engaging students in university and high school. And again, this connection with the university was very key because these people, the students were very plugged into the discussion, became very good allies and third-party validators moving forward, and they participated in the dialogue. Again, as housing affordability and choice are pressing issues in the city, finally, we created and worked very hard to establish a link to the professionals, advocates, and academic partners, including people in the design and development industry, to have them around the table participating in the discussion. They really acted as very key third-party validators. And again, a ton of work went into this. We engaged thousands of people and worked very hard to have discussions with folks. the voices were critical, providing third-party validation of the concepts staff were presenting. And in a lot of ways, when we got up at council, I mean, staff could kind of just get away from the mic, and it didn't become our plan. I love how Ron says it's the we part, because it is the we. It's our plan. It's the city's plan moving forward. And so the planning department actually got away from it being their plan. I think that was very key. The university and the relationship with the university, and it's very appropriate that we're having this discussion here, I think, Roger, because that partnership in terms of that third-party validation around the metrics and the decision-making was absolutely critical in our plan success in terms of getting the plan approved. We could show the pretty pictures, but it was very, very important to have Ron and his students, and Ina's there, another one of the students who was here who did some work on the plan, and just having them as part of that work was massively important in terms of getting the plan approved. So now I'll turn it over to you, Ron, to kind of further discuss that collaboration.
Okay. So this is the context in which I kind of entered this, and the reference to Ina is Ina was a grad student at UBC and was our research assistant in our lab. She now works in the Toronto area somewhere, I've forgotten where, but apparently it was employable skills that she gained from the experience, so we must be doing something okay. So where I entered into this was exactly in that forum that Jim was telling you about a moment ago, the notion of a kind of exchange between professionals, academics, advocates, critics, etc. So what my research group does is that we create what I would call lightweight methods of measured visualization. I'm sure that sounds very opaque to all of you, but what we try to figure out how to do is to be able to bring some rigor and discipline to really early design thinking stages. And as a result, be able to elevate things that are actually hard to tell at the beginning with some kind of discipline around them. And I'll show you some examples about what I mean about that. So what we wanted to be able to do was link the sustainability metrics that the city had said was important to the pictures that we were all bringing back to them. So in this particular case, this example is just a way of kind of framing that for you, is that we took every one of the neighborhood stations that were on that list of neighborhoods that Jim showed you a moment ago, and then we created a mechanism whereby we could iterate quite quickly what happens if we put the building types and district energy assumptions that are being discussed at this meeting or at this practitioners advisory session, and what would be the results of that. And then we made these visualizations of what happened if you did those things. So of all these things, they're always to the same scale. And they always show at the bottom is kind of where the plan is at the moment, where it says current there, and they don't all start in the same place. And then the length of the line is how much did that place move against that criteria because of the planning instruments. So in order to do that, we had to kind of be fast about this. So we used a method that we use in our academic approaches all the time, is that we used a case-based method. And in that particular case, we no pun intended, we collect a series of examples of all the different land use types or building types or street types that are being discussed, and we begin to find ways to connect the pictures and the 3D models to the numbers, and so that people who get the numbers can now see the pictures, people who get the pictures can now see what the numbers mean are associated with that. And these are actually real, live, living, breathing 3D models, and they have data associated with them. So what we would do is that we'd listen to people and say, well, we don't really want 6-story buildings in that segment of the block. Let's put them at the end of the block. So we would take cases that had that dimension to them, and we would literally rearrange them according to what people were saying. And then because these all have data associated with them, then we can measure stuff about them. We can tell you how many people lived there, how much thermal density was created by that alternative, et cetera. And Jim mentioned this, and the only reason I bring this up is because I thought this was an interesting spin on our particular way of working. The city wanted appropriately better, kind of more accessible visualization, so we worked with an illustrator, and what the illustrator did is take models like that up on the top left and take air photos and then create these visualizations on the right. Now, the mind-boggling thing about this is that the working surface that this person made these things on is about that big. And so she took a rough sketch that was about the right size that we knew was truthed against the numbers, and then she would kind of, innovate on that, I guess would be a way of saying that. But again, we were confident that the pictures looked like the numbers, and so our anxiety level went down. So the kinds of questions we were presented with was things like this: how much land use intensification, was it distributed, How many people's and jobs really? Is it supportive of transit at the end? Is it supportive of community energy? And what did it look like? Let's not do that. So again, these are examples of buildings that are actually in Vancouver that have been built, most of them recently, but not always, and they represent the kind of built forms that were in the diagrams that were part of the planning discussion. And then these were dropped into that three-dimensional model, as we said, with the data being pulled out of it. All the numbers were extracted from those things, so you could not only interrogate the corridor, you could look at the building type, and then out of that was created these histograms. So in this particular one, there was one histogram for each stop. So this is Oak Ridge, and there are pictures of what it looks like now at the bottom. There are pictures of the building types that are dropped into that model. And then in cases where we could provide one, we went and found another part of the city that was about the same performance, right? They may have very different building types, but it was just a way, again, to truth the numbers against the appearances. And then we showed people not only how that stop performed, but how would that stop compare with all the other ones along the way. And again, the Oak Ridge one I just showed you is the one that changes in density the most relative to all the others. So you could see, oh, the shopping center took most of the share of the population and jobs. We didn't gang up on the neighborhoods at 25th and whatever. And we did the same thing with dwelling density. We did the same thing with transit. And as again, the numbers that we discussed earlier, all the stops now fell between with what we considered to be the lower range and the upper range. One of them went to the upper range, which was the one that Jim showed you at the end with the big looming employment towers at the bottom. Because that was an employment center, no one thought that was a bad thing. It was just about the right distribution. And from the district energy point of view, again, the two benchmarks we looked at, on the bottom is Dockside Green, on the top is Southeast Falls Creek. That particular transit stop that I just showed you the example of a moment ago fell somewhere in the middle. But if you backed up and look at all the stops, what you discovered is that with a few exceptions, King Edward would be one of them, which was the 3 to 4 story example, they all were likely to be able to be met by district energy planning at the same time.
So what have we learned? So when what's happening now, kind of learning in real time, and this is where things get interesting, because the total disclaimer on this is that nothing's been built yet. The plan was approved. So it has. I mean, the plan was approved in about 8 months ago. This summer, I think the development will get significant and serious along the corridor, and we're going to see some significant transformation along the corridor. So I'll quickly go through some of the development applications that we're seeing and fielding. We have about 8 rezoning applications in, about 20 inquiries, and things are definitely heating up along the corridor. So, I mean, this is just one example of a 6-story building in a commercial area. It's an interesting story because it's the 2-lot consolidation of some 1951-story bungalows that are going to a building of about 67 feet high. Goes from property line to property line on the side yards, significant urban building. This is a different form in an area right adjacent to a station where there's, again, this is a development by PCI Developments, submitted by Perkins and Will. Two residential towers and a significant office component, bordering on an industrial area, in an employment area in the city of Vancouver at the south end of the line. This is an application close to a park, and so you can see like the responses to these things in different areas. So this is close to a park, lower scale, dealing with views, bigger setbacks. It's only a 5-story building. I believe they're coming in totally under wood frame construction. We haven't nailed that down, but it's a smaller building with about 41 units in it. So just a whole diversity of different applications moving forward. Here's one of the big rubs right now, and this is one of the things that we're facing, and so it's an interesting challenge. One of the challenges that we're facing as this plan starts to get implemented is the issue of real estate speculation. So property values have significantly increased along the corridor once the plan was approved. And of course you would expect that. First you have the transit investment, so property values are going to rise anyways, and then you have an approved plan. But it's the kind of, I think, the magnitude on which they're rising that has us a little bit concerned. So remember, this is the Vancouver context. So properties that a couple of years ago would have sold for, like a single family house on the west side for about $1.5 million, they're now selling in the range of about 3.4. Couple have sold for about $4 million. So there's some significant sales. I know, it's crazy. And And so one of our biggest challenges, and we're working very hard with the development industry on this, and we're even looking at some new tools on this, we're working hard to ensure that primarily the vendors and the developers are aware that as part of development, the city will be working really hard to ensure that the community amenity contributions are going to be reinvested back into the communities, that the development cost levies are part of that equation. And making sure, I mean, the developers are aware of it, but the people who are selling their houses, who want a piece of the action also need to be made aware of that. And we've been talking to an awful lot of folks about that as that's moved forward. So, I mean, right now we're somewhat concerned that these contributions, development contributions, are not necessarily getting reflected in sales prices when houses are getting sold for sort of approaching $5 million. I mean, there's only so much juice in the orange, and that is a concern right now. But we're confident. What we're seeing right now is that a lot of places have options on them, but they haven't quite sold, and the market's really starting to kind of calm down on the corridor. But I think, I mean, the big test is, and I'm not joking when I say this, it's almost like call me in a year and I'll tell you how that's going. We've seen a number of developments approved where we sort of publicized what those CACs are, so the expectation is out there in the community and the development industry. And I think it's just a matter of kind of being patient and letting things incrementally proceed along the corridor. But a really key thing from the city's perspective is that density done well requires that the amenities that we finance through the granting of rezoning rights remains in the community. So again, this is just part of this. This density done well is a key thing, and our public realm improvements and social infrastructure are all dependent on our ability to negotiate the community amenity contributions and acquire the development cost levies. The other thing I think is really key is that the plan is not finished. So we still need to go back and complete the plan for the surrounding neighborhood. While we've introduced some possible housing forms and types for the surrounding neighborhoods, we've not completed the detailed work. And I think this could really be an interesting challenge moving forward. But one of the things that I think is quite interesting, and it kind of harkens back to a comment a councillor made when we were on the floor presenting the Phase 2 plan, is that she saw this as the city kind of getting the big pieces of furniture in place, and in terms of like a living room, you're getting your big pieces of furniture in place, you're really setting a tone for how things are going to go, and it's quite true. Some of the folks who were really against this plan, about 2 years ago, have now kind of come up and said, okay, so they've approved that. They've just approved that rezoning application. I'll get the phone call. So, can I get in on this now? How can I sell my house? There's a couple of situations, where a group of 30 neighbors have got together, and it's a tough thing on the west side to consolidate 30 single family houses. And I said, look, we've done this. We have a deal. Can we come in and talk to you about the redevelopment of our site? And it's kind of like, oh, okay, that's interesting. I didn't necessarily expect that would happen in the first couple of years, but it's something that's definitely happened, and it'll definitely affect our planning as we move forward. So what are we taking away? What's worked well? I think that the phased approach was critical, and sort of this strategic incrementalism moving forward. Getting the important pieces chosen and in the right place was really critical. Set the tone, let people know that we were serious about direction. It also allowed our council, to not have to make all the decisions all at once. It was a very kind of, one step at a time type of thing, where we're going to get the principles right, we're going to get buy-in, everybody around the table is going to nod about that. We're going to get the public realm stuff right, we're all going to nod about that and kind of understand the relationship between density done well and amenities. And then we're going to introduce the built form, right? And so it's kind of the bringing along of those different pieces in an incremental phase that really paid off in a big way. This is also really critical. I think maybe one of the most critical things of all is bridging the gap between the urban design, where we spent a lot of time showing people what things look like, and the sustainability performance was critical. Basically, the approach allowed us to provide a defensible metric for density. And so, you can imagine you're out at a community meeting, and the culture of Vancouver, people will say, oh, no, we want to do density, that's fine, but let's just do townhouses. And so if you go, but you say, okay, you run the numbers on townhouses in terms of how it performs from a sustainability perspective in terms of transit ridership and district energy. We work with our third-party colleagues at UBC, and you get to a point where it's just, hey, that's just not going to cut it. And you then staff has a defensible way to go to council and say, look, we've heard you, we understand, but if these are our big picture goals and our principles, what you're suggesting isn't going to get us there, so we need to do more and better. So this work allowed us to provide that metric, not only showing like through the histograms, that type of stuff, but really reconciling it with the urban design piece and showing the link between those two things. Finally, and again, I think this is critical and really appropriate that we're sitting at a place like this in a university, The third-party partnerships and validators were critical, not only in industry and in the community and the usual suspects, but the university and Ron's work was absolutely critical. It kind of, in some ways, knocked it out of the park for us. Again, Ron talking in front of council, sometimes people, even your own councillors, don't necessarily trust the planners, and to have people and sort of have people have it as their plan was really critical. There was buy-in, public buy-in, but the third-party validators, not just experts, but community folks, all those types of people, and again, the university and academic partnerships were really, really key. And it opened up a more honest conversation in terms of what we wanted to put forward in this plan. So validators there, sorry, I wasn't on that slide. So thank you very much for this. We went a little bit over time, but I think it was valuable. I think that this work in terms of the City of Vancouver could really signal a new way in terms of us moving forward. I think that the work of a number of our planners, including Lil, moving forward, this reconciling of performance metrics and visualization was very key. And I think it kind of opens up a new chapter for us in the City of Vancouver, and hopefully we can all learn some lessons from this. So thank you for your time. Thank you very much. It's been a great experience. Thank you.
There are so many things to talk about. One of the things I think that NEPTUS does very well is they bring really interesting and fresh people together to offer reflections on how challenging it is to build a city region in an area as complex as ours. They've assembled a crackerjack team of 5 panelists, and we are ruthlessly only giving them 5 minutes each, after which our 2 guests from Vancouver will offer a few concluding comments. The good news, can everyone get your white tickets out for a second? That is good for a glass of wine. And there will also be pasta and salad served. So we will have our public engagement piece, family style, in a meal with wine and pasta after this is over, which will give you lots of opportunity to ask your questions of the panelists and our speakers at a later point. So I'm going to ask Diana Burchell to come up in just a moment. She's got 25 years of combined architectural planning and urban design experience in both the public and private sector, and she's now the Director of Policy and Planning and Urban Design for the City of Vaughan, where she oversees the development and administration of land use and urban design policy, including strategies to guide growth and change the city. She's working very hard with her colleagues on enhancing the public realm and addressing planning and physical development in the city, and this has been principally the focus of her 25-year career. This has included considerations of land use and built form, site area organization in the public realm, and this has been applied through a whole range of really interesting and contemporary planning issues in Vaughan, including the City of Vaughan's new official plan, which is forward-looking, the Metropolitan Centre Secondary Plan, the Steeles West Secondary Plan, and the Yonge Street Steeles Corridor Secondary Plan, among many. And her work, in addition to these secondary plans, has focused on issues around natural heritage, the 4 heritage conservation district plans, the cycling and pedestrian master plans, sustainable development performance standards, environmental management guides, and parking standards reviews. So I'm going to invite Diana to come on up. And I'm going to leave there's a few of my students here. I have my nasty iPad on the podium to help people track time. And she's going to give you some discussant thoughts about what we've just heard. There you go.
Thank you, Pamela. And thank you, Jim and Ron. That was a really fantastic presentation. And you're right, there is so much to talk about, but we don't have much time, as you pointed out. And there's also so much that's of relevance to our region. The aspect that I want to talk about tonight is what was experienced in the Cambie corridor example has also been experienced in Vaughan, and that is that if you build higher order transit, you will get development. And I have some actual examples that I wanted to show you, and that the converse is also true, that if you don't build it, you will continue to get primarily very suburban forms of development, because you need this kind of initiative to precipitate the kind of urban development that these outer GTA municipalities are all trying to encourage. And there's something interesting in the Weekend Globe that I came across, an article by Adrian Morrow, who said that the TTC in Toronto, nearly 3 times as many riders as all 9 other transit systems in the GTA and Hamilton combined. And Toronto's streetcar network alone carries more people than the entire GO system. However, he went on to say the population of the GTA and Hamilton region is expected to grow by 2 million, most of whom will settle outside Toronto by 2031. So our challenge is, how do you achieve an urban form, a concentration of urban development without necessarily having that complete transit infrastructure in place? However, what's up there is our urban structure map, and what it shows you is this massive green area, countryside, green belt, Oak Ridges Moraine, that is protected countryside to the north. We concentrate development to the south. We have a very small urban boundary expansion. This is very similar to many GTA municipalities, or similar approach to what we're taking, although our structures vary according to particular circumstances. And what you also see are sort of patches of color which represent our local centers, primary centers, and the purple patches are Vaughan Metropolitan Center. And we have a series of transit things, which are transit initiatives, which our plan responds to, which is the Viva Next higher order transit in a dedicated right-of-way all along Highway 7, which links Markham through Vaughan to Brampton, the extension of the Spadina subway station up to the Vaughan Metropolitan Center, and a station at the 407 and a station at Steeles West. And then we have a rapid transit corridor up Jane, another one along Major Mackenzie and Rutherford Road. And then we have the GO line, which is planned to be twinned at some point. Currently, it only goes in one direction. And so, oh, I didn't want to do that. Let's see. Okay, that's the only other slide that I'm going to show. And I wanted to talk particularly about the Vaughan Metropolitan Center, the Steeles West Plan, and the Young Steeles Plan. All secondary planning exercises, very, very similar, in fact, to the Cambie exercises, in all the things that one needs to think about. And that the example of the Vaughan Metropolitan Center, because the subway is coming to it, we're planning for 12,000 units and 135,000 square meters of office by 2031. It would double by 2051, and the 2031 number is the 200 people and jobs per hectare, which is the urban growth, which is what this place is, urban growth center. Target is 400 people and jobs by 2051. And we have current applications for 6,800 residential units, 13,600 square meters of office. And then if you take into account the potential applications, the other ones that we're talking about, we have another 2,000 residential units and 49,000 square meters of office. And that really gets us to about half of the target to 2031. I am out of time. Very quickly then, I wanted to touch upon some, you know what, I'm not going to go through the similarities and differences, because just suffice to say that we did focus on many of the things that you did, and that some of perhaps the differences was that you do have the good fortune, I think, of and the challenge of being adjacent to an established neighborhood, and that our challenge then as a new downtown is to ensure diversity when you're building something from scratch, and that you kind of have to ensure a certain amount of crankiness is built into that. And that maybe finally, I just want to say, and I think I might be speaking for other people in this room, in that not only do we have Vancouver Charter, lack of OMB, and mountain and sea envy, I think we also have green envy, in that we're all trying to achieve completely sustainable communities, but I think you have that advantage in terms of the False Creek and the Dockside Green. Those are communities that have been comprehensively large comprehensive developments that have sort of systematically achieved very sustainable communities, and we're still looking to do that. I mean, we're starting in the waterfront in Toronto and so on, but we still want to get to that point where we can point to something and say, you know, this is how you do it. So thank you very much.
So I'm next going to welcome Frank Giannone up to our podium. He's the president of Fram Building Group and a graduate of a civil engineering program at the University of Toronto. He entered his family business in 1981, and he's a fourth-generation home builder. He's a builder and a developer of fine and mixed-use residential communities in the Greater Toronto Area, in Dallas, Texas, and soon to start their first development in Calgary. So it's nice to see we're exporting some good work from Calgary because we seem envious of them of late. Frank's the past president of the Toronto Home Builders Association and of the Ontario Home Builders Association, and he's a member of the board of directors of Tarion, which is Ontario's new home warranty program. So come on up, Frank, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Pamela. So I made some notes because we've been asked to look at things that were presented today that inspire us, that innovations that inspire us. I'm going to be a little bit of skeptic with some of them because whether or not they compare between Vancouver and what we have in the GTA is something that I wish they did. As a developer, have the opportunities that are presented out in Vancouver. I want to start off with, you know, I am a developer, I am a builder. I consider our company to be a community builder, but we are market driven. So what we do is based on what the market wants, what we think that the market wants. We do a lot of research to determine that. We are profit centered, of course. The good news is that almost everything that's been presented today in the GTA, there is a huge market demand for it. Lifestyle, the kind of lifestyle that people want to live, excuse me, today, whether they're young or whether they're old, centers around being pedestrian, being able to walk to places, that are nearby, being in places that are communities rather than individual buildings. For too long, we've been developing individual buildings within the city of Toronto and the suburbs of Toronto, and forgetting about how the community and how the grade situation, you know, it doesn't matter how tall it is, it's what happens at grade that people really get the opportunity to benefit from. And people are understanding that, and that's pushing us as a development industry to create that kind of a community. I can say that, you know, our company has had pretty good experience with a couple of these. We've completed our Port Credit development on the waterfront in Mississauga, and we've done we're into our third building that we're selling now in the Don Mills development. And the East Village development that we're starting to sell on the weekend, and my nerves are there because, you know, we'll see how things go on the weekend, but the East Village development on the edge of downtown Calgary is very similar to the things that have been presented here today. And I'm buoyed by what we've seen, and we were picked in Calgary because some of the things that we did in Port Credit and Don Mills. The planning process, if I'm not mistaken, Vancouver is citywide council. That's the big problem that we've got here. You know, you can talk about the OMB and whether the OMB is good or bad, but when we've seen it in Collingwood where we work with a citywide council, when you work with a citywide council versus a ward council situation, you're bound to get the battles. And the battles are the tough part. You know, we've worked hard with dealing with our communities in terms of consultation. We do a lot more consultation than other developers do. We try to get people to buy in. We do get support from communities for what we do because a lot of people see themselves living where we do the right thing, where we create the plazas, where we create the cafes, where we program the plazas to have music every weekend. You know, we see people wanting to be there, and so we get a lot of support, and that comes from heavy consultation. But too many times that consultation is being undermined by the planning departments. The planning departments aren't progressive. We tend to see, Toronto is a little bit different. The City of Toronto has been fairly progressive in terms of how it's dealing with its density, but we do see corridor studies, corridor directions, both in the city that we have in a couple of places and more outside the city where we have existing rapid transit lines, and the studies don't make economical sense. They overlay a density, they overlay a style of building that is worth less in the land value than the existing use that's on those properties. So that tells me that they'd rather see nothing happen, nothing change, than be progressive and say, let's create a value that will see some change happen, see some density happen, see a change to the community along the main streets. My time's running out, so real quick, CAC versus Section 37. So we've done it twice, and both times I've been treated as bribing the community, right? So big difference. You guys do it proactively. City of Toronto has been fairly proactive with it, but as you move further away from the core of the City of Toronto, you're treated more like a criminal for actually suggesting that there's a Section 37 or CAC advantage to doing the project. So my time's run out. I thank you. I'm open for questions afterwards.
The next speaker that I'm going to invite up to the podium is Antonio Gomez Palacio, and he's a principal partner in Dialogue and also a founding partner in the Office of Urbanism. He's a respected award-winning urban designer, having worked in many countries around the world. His professional research and experience focuses on the intersection of architecture, planning, and urban design, and he's worked on a wide range of projects and master plans, from urban intensification to mixed use to urban community economic development and sustainable development and heritage issues. So we're next going to welcome him up to offer his perspectives. Come on up. Welcome. That's it. I'm the Grim Reaper of time.
So I think we were all convinced of moving to Vancouver until you started expressing the house prices, and then we just shut off. Thanks very much for the presentations. They were amazing. I'm currently working on 3 different LRT projects and corridors in Edmonton and Mississauga and Brampton and Hamilton, and tackling some very similar issues. So I thought I'd jotted down 4 different observations that are kind of parallel to what I'm hearing today. The first one is, you should not fire the head of the transit committee. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong. Sorry about that. The first one I thought I would jot down was, you cannot suck and blow at the same time. And that's something quite clear that I heard, and I see the nodding going on. You could see in the body language as they were presenting, they talked about putting pedestrians first and walking and transit and others. There's a lot of really tough decisions that need to be made along the road. And I could see it very much in the presentations. And it's often the case that negotiating that right of way, you have to say no on multiple occasions. You can't suck and blow at the same time. By the same token, the second one I wrote down was, complexity is a good sign. As soon as you find that complexity is going on, and I paraphrase actually Larry Beasley from Vancouver, who said, traffic is your friend. As soon as you see traffic, as soon as you see complexity, as soon as you see those environments that are really getting thorny, that's probably a really good thing. As soon as you see hundreds of people coming out to a meeting and wanting to have a conversation, wanting to debate, and that's probably a really good thing. And that's exactly what we want to see happen. The integration of planning and urban design and transportation, getting to that point of complexity is actually an objective. So it's not something to fear, it's something actually to embrace. The third one I wrote down is, there's no room for backroom visions. And I'll, again, paraphrase from a mayor who will remain nameless, who in a particular incident that included monorails and other pieces of infrastructure was referring to the fact that this was not a backroom deal, it was a backroom vision. I thought that was phenomenal. But in any case, what you're expressing, and I think it's the case everywhere, when we're tackling environments of such complexity, it has to be an open conversation. It has to be an engaging environment. It has to be an environment of transparency. And that, I think, is critical, and this is a really good example of that, and it's one that I hope we can embrace in a very broad sense. The last one, and this is kind of particularly to all the students in the room, is follow the money. Every time that you hear $2.1 billion being spent somewhere, follow that cash. I don't know what the budget was for the planning department to do this work. It was probably in the couple $100,000s of dollars. The amount of budget invested in terms of the public realm was in the couple of million of dollars. It's the transportation departments that have the billions of dollars to do this. And it's really interesting in my mind. A lot of the really interesting projects that are happening right now is, in fact, trying to capitalize on some of these broader infrastructure projects for city building objectives. And it's not a facetious exercise. When we start to tie it back down to sustainability, when we try and tie it back down to the difference between the cost and the value and the investment in our city environments, it's following these pots of cash, it's following these moments of investment where there's a real opportunity, because then we can make the argument that, hey, we're investing in transit, then we have to make the urban realm, we have to make the public realm that much better, because it is about supporting transit and it's using transit to support those environments. So if you're thinking of your plans of study, you're thinking of where to go, just keep that in mind. Thank you very much.
The next speaker that I'm going to invite up, Antonio gave us a great segue. It's Daniel Hufschild, and he's the Director of Policy and Planning at Metrolinx. So you said follow the money. Daniel's going to come up and talk about his reaction to how things work. He's going to kill me. Metrolinx undertakes, as we all know, I think, a large number of regional transportation and planning issues in our region, including our regional airport rail link, the Presto Smart Card, which is about fare integration, and Go Transit, which is our regional bus and rail system. As director, he's responsible for the regional transportation plan known as the Big Move, mobility hubs and station planning, and service planning for the Go and bus rail network. So Daniel's observations about the Cambie experience, I think, are going to be really interesting, because he, if anyone, lives on a day-to-day basis the complexity of trying to integrate big moves into the fabric of our city and our region. So come on up.
Thank you. I think this is a case of the money following. I think it's so. Thank you, Antonio. That's actually a great segue. What I took away from the presentations was a lot about learning and culture. I've been with Metrolinx for 2 years now, and there's been quite a lot of learning and probably a whole lot more culture than I'd like, but it's interesting. And it's a learning experience. I think a key difference, so there were a lot of things that resonated me with the Vancouver experience. Metrolinx is a little different in that we plan. We have a planning function in terms of transit and planning around our stations. We deliver infrastructure and we operate transit. So our function's a little different in that we're not a municipal planning authority. But we do advance planning goals, and really through two ways. And to build on Antonio, the two sort of principles that we use is follow the land and follow the money. So thank you for that transition. And by that I mean that follow the land is that Metrolinx, and particularly Go Transit, is quite a significant landholder. So we really are looking at opportunities to leverage our land asset and to maximize the potential of that in a number of ways. And one of the key ways is looking at adjacent property owners, joint development, and how can we maximize, if we look at the area as a whole, the benefit to the community in terms of the type of development that can occur around the station on the site. And the objective is really to support the transit investment in terms of access to stations, ridership, and just kind of creating wonderful communities around our stations. Enjoy to, and there's learning there because we're not a developer, quite clearly. We don't have a huge amount of experience. We've come a long way in 2 years, but it's certainly an area that we're really working our way through. We've had some small successes. but it's early days, I'd say, on that front, and there's probably some agreement in my peers. In terms of the money, we're investing a huge amount, well over 14 billion around the region, and one of the big unsung ones is GO. There's actually quite a lot of investment in GO that doesn't get as much airplay. And our objective there is really to undertake station area planning around the stations to leverage that asset. If we're investing heavily, if we can take a little thoughtful design around our stations, we can create a sum that's greater than the parts. So really about advancing our investment. And with that is about a year ago, we adopted mobility hub guidelines. And that's really picking up some of the principles from the Vancouver experience, which is about seamless mobility, creating places, and implementation. And the pedestrian hierarchy, or the modal hierarchy, where pedestrians are first, is certainly a piece of that. It's well documented. Our board asked us a year ago to look at all our investments in light of the Mobility Hub guidelines, and we're doing that. Again, it's early days, and we're figuring that out, but we have some successes. So there is a lot of learning in terms of how do we do good planning and do it quickly. One of our big challenges is that the pace of development is fast. So on Eglinton, on Georgetown Corridor, we're also building the airport railing, so we're getting one just like Vancouver. The challenge there is doing good planning ahead of design, because the moment you get to 10% design, things are already starting to lock down. By the time you're 30% and above, it's pretty much decided. So a key for us, and I'd be interesting to hear about the Vancouver experience, is get in strategically. We've also looked at stations on Eglinton. We're looking at corridor wide. And we've had a couple of successes. In the case of Bloor Dundas, it's going to be an airport station. We were able to get in early. We did the planning just as the design was advancing, and we've radically changed the nature of the design that is coming out of that. And in particular, it's about creating a light, airy space that's welcoming. If you know Bloor Dundas, it's probably the worst GO station in the entire network. It's kind of like walking into a bunker. And we're really trying to open up that station so it has frontage on the street, it communicates to the street, and it's light and airy, and there's good connectivity. So I think that's key. And maybe one last point just on Weston, and I think I see Adam in the audience. We're doing, and this is more about partnerships. In the case of Weston, it's very different from Toronto in that the investment and the land potential around the station is more challenging. We partnered with the city, the Urban Land Institute, and looked at how can we transform that community. And I think one of the big conclusions out of that study was that the investment itself isn't enough to transform Weston. There has to be more. So I think that's a bit different from the Vancouver experience. And what we're doing, and I'll just conclude on this point, we're really looking at how we can catalyze development. So we're working with institutions around the regions, with private developers, with a church that owns an adjacent property, and we're really trying to create an opportunity of, essentially get an anchor tenant to create the mass and the body heat to transform that area, which the transit investment on its own can't do. So follow the money and follow the land. Thank you.
Our final panelist today is a homegrown professor from York University. I'd like to welcome Dr. Uta Lair up to the podium. She's an associate professor in the Faculty of Environmental Studies here and a world-renowned planner and designer. She also holds an adjunct professorship at SUNY Buffalo, and she's the vice president for North America of the International Sociological Association and the Research Committee 21. She's a founding member of the International Network of Urban Research and Action and is an elected board member of the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research. She's also a very accomplished researcher and scholar, holding 2 major grants right now from our National Research Council related to issues around suburbanization in global cities. Her planning practice and research has also been recognized by the American Institute of Certified Planners, the American Planning Association, among many. So the final word goes to you. Thank you. Come on up.
Thank you very much. This was quite a nice introduction. I obviously have the final word here. which I did not expect. So in a certain way, I have to respond to everybody. We were invited to respond to this presentation with our own thoughts. And I more come from the academic side. So my question is, I start with, if they build, will they come? This is something that we always learn, throughout the history of planning and architecture. And there are different examples. So, for example, there is, and I love this picture of Vancouver in the forest, the streetcar going through the forest. Obviously, they came. They also came to Los Angeles when they built streetcars there. Nobody today thinks about this anymore when they visit or talk about Los Angeles. But it didn't work in Buffalo, just 2 hours south of here, where they built an LRT system in the 1980s, 70s, 80s, and increased a dynamic that already existed in that city, which we call the white flight, where people are moving out of the city. It completely destroyed the inner city along the main street. Ironically, in the context of Toronto's discussion, above ground, below ground, it's a mixture. Downtown, it is above ground. Outside of where people live, it's below ground. So it's very interesting to compare these two cities with one another, and we always should think about examples where it didn't work and what went wrong. So when we talk about if they build, will they come, and what planning approach do we take here? I certainly appreciate very much the conversation that we have with the Vancouver experience, particularly when we call it the we plan. I really like this approach because it actually started, as you have heard and witnessed in this presentation, with a relatively large vision. The vision, from my perspective, is based on a fundamental understanding of sustainability that is not an add-on, but it's the founding principle of a vision that goes beyond Ferris wheels and monorails, clearly. The We Plan also agrees to that cities are complex systems, and the complexity has to have multiple layers, and we have to look at them from the pedestrian all the way up. And then thirdly, I'm just rushing through here because I know we are running out of time. What is very, very important from my perspective, and again in the Vancouver case that was also exemplary done, is the public discourse around what kind of development we have. And this is not only in the mayor's office or the planning's office, but it has to include everybody in the city, from the inhabitants to the users to the academics to the writers about in journals and so on. And I think that one of the really interesting points that came up here was that we not only have to talk about who is there, but we also have to talk about the future and include the future generation in ways that give them a voice. Let me end with a question mark. So we now heard that the property values go from 1.5 to 3 million overnight. If we're lucky and own a house there, we get rich. And there was one moment where in this talk where I kind of went, huh? And I forgot who that was, who you were quoting, the cappuccino quote. The person who said public space is there where you sit with your cappuccino, not at Tim Hortons, and you watch beautiful people. And so there is something that I want to tie to one another, this quote, by watching beautiful people walking by, sipping cappuccino, and the real estate value, the speculative aspect of what is going on in Vancouver or in any city that we live in where we have certain forms of development, and take it with a little bit critical perspective. So I just want to end on this note, on a more critical perspective, that not everything is beautiful and everybody's included, and we all are rich at the end of the day. Thank you very much.
Okay, so Jim is going to come up and offer a few closing words, and then I will wrap us up and send us on our merry way.
So I'll be very quick. I think that criticism is actually perfect, because I think that addressing that issue and sort of social inclusion and all the social amenities and rental housing and social housing and non-market housing is really key, and it remains, I think, our biggest challenge on this corridor moving forward. And perhaps I need to do a better job of kind of conveying this in the presentation, but those kind of values were also very central to this plan, and I don't want to be defensive at all, but that is our biggest challenge. In a rising speculative market, how do we continue to make sure that there's housing for all, social housing for all, and that it is inclusive? And I think we're doing a good job of that in some ways. We're seeing these units land. We are negotiating prices down, and that's going to be something that, as I said at the beginning of this, I don't know how all of this is going to end up, but it's certainly top of mind as we move forward. So thank you for that. And it's a very important criticism. I think we very much need to have our feet to the fire on that one as we work with industry and as we kind of look ourselves in the mirror. Are we doing a good job? I guess the last thing, the kind of thought that I would like to leave with, and it kind of builds on what Frank said in his presentation around kind of the marketing of this. I think that this whole notion of complete communities around transit, where you have walkable communities and your homes are heated with district energy, and this move to sustainability, it's inevitable. It's going to happen. Like the price of oil and the price of gas, you look at the kind of market signals in terms of where we're heading, and the kind of transformative future that we're talking about, it's not an if, it's going to happen. It's just a matter of when, I think, in a lot of cases. Yesterday we had a discussion. There was a professor from the University of Toronto, from the Department of Geography, and he was kind of talking about the context of Toronto and all the challenges that are happening. And he was funny, I thought, in some ways. He was almost dismissive of the challenges and saying, whatever, we're going to figure this out, and at the end of the day, we have to get to a sustainable pattern, and it will happen. I think the challenge for all of us is getting in front of it and making sure that we kind of have the pieces in place that when it costs whatever, like $200 to fill up your car, that we can start to make these transitions, because the time is coming, and it's about getting in front of it and making sure that people are engaged in this conversation. So I think that's really quite critical. And so having this discussion in this room is really key. Like I keep thinking the most important thing is about future looking, about engaging younger people, pushing the envelope on the discussion, because it's just something that's going to happen, and we just need to make sure that we're there when it does. So thank you very much for your time.
Okay, final parting words. There are a whole bunch of people I think that we need to say thank you to. So first, let's welcome our guests from Vancouver for an insightful evening. Thank you. I'd also really like to thank our panelists. We could have filled 15 days with their big ideas, and they gave us their top 5 minutes in reaction to a really interesting panel. So thank you very much to all of you for coming too. And I'd like to thank our hosts at York University. Thank you for letting us come. Thank you for helping to sponsor the event. Thank you for a beautiful room. And thank you for giving us some context about what's happening here. I think it's good learning for us all. And finally, as we head out to eat and have a drink, thank you to the Neptis Foundation for your sponsorship of this evening, but also for being kind enough to look after everyone's sustenance and give the opportunity for discussion. So we would have loved to have had 2 hours of question and answer, but instead we can talk over dinner, and we'll go up in a moment. Tony, would you like to add anything else?
No, except to reinforce that from Neptis' point of view. It's very good of you all to come and to take the time to do this. And certainly that includes Frank, it includes Ron and Jim, but also Uta and Diana and Frank and Daniel and Tony. Thank you very much.